Some children queued up in a Mexican school that morning before going to class. Meanwhile, at the staff office, before class began, the principal handed out cakes to the teachers to welcome the new semester. At that point, the principal announced that their school's average score percent on the most recent final test was the lowest in the whole country. In addition, more than half of their 6th grade kids dropped out last year. He hoped that the pupils will be able to do better this year. After that, when the principal attempted to introduce a new instructor, he was perplexed as to why the new teacher was absent. Meanwhile, when the students were ready to enter the classroom, they were astonished to discover the tables overturned and chairs stacked up in the corner. Inside, they found the new instructor waiting for them. His name was Sergio. He instantly instructed all of the kids to leap aboard the upturned table, thinking of it as a ship. Students were taken aback by the new teacher's unusual behavior. When the principal walked around to examine the status of the classes, he was surprised to find Sergio's classroom so disorganized and the youngsters playing on toppled tables. He entered the classroom and was going to protest when Sergio instantly ordered his pupils to save the principal and take him to the ship so he wouldn't drown. But because the principal was obese, the kids predicted that their ship would sink. Sergio then inquired about what causes a ship to float and how to measure the ship's capacity. The pupils remained mute and unaware, and Sergio, it seemed, was no exception. Because no one knew, Sergio invited them to the computer room to hunt for answers on the internet. Unfortunately, the principal informed them that they couldn't use the computer room. Fortunately, Sergio had not run out of ideas. He welcomed all pupils to the library. When they got at the library, there were very few books available, and they were all old. Sergio would not give up on discovering the answers. He then inquired as to how an object might float and instructed his students that he would not be offended if they spoke up, no matter what they said. He informed them that there was no truth without errors. Hearing that, one of the pupils stated that they had always been terrified of answering incorrectly because if they continued to do so, their scores would suffer and they may fail the test. Sergio vowed to give them all excellent ratings, but the pupils stayed mute, fearful of answering badly. They were still traumatized by receiving a poor grade. After school, the principal heard a disturbance outside and discovered Sergio pulling a table out of the classroom. Sergio said that he didn't need the table in his lesson. Sergio's unusual behavior perplexed the principal, who chastised him and told him that if he wanted to use the playground as a classroom, he could just teach in the yard. Sergio decided to quit after hearing the nagging. He also inquired about the computer room. The room turned out to be vacant. The principal stated that this room had a computer 4 years ago, but it was broken into barely 2 months after, and all of the computers were taken. The only computer remaining was the one in his office. Despite the fact that the first day of school did not go as planned, Sergio piqued the interest of one of the kids, Paloma, in learning. Paloma was an extremely bright student. Despite the fact that she lived in poverty and her father was a scavenger, she remained excited about education. She regularly gathered books she discovered while scavenging with her father. Unfortunately, her father did not support her. Her father believed school to be a waste of time. Meanwhile, Sergio's pupil, Nico, was spotted playing near the gang headquarters since his brother was a member. He frequently hung out and was even close to the gang's boss. Every time he went there, the gang leader always invited him to join, but his brother refused because he loved him and did not want his younger brother to become a criminal like him. Sergio shared a story about a donkey in class the following day. One day, a donkey fell down an extremely deep, empty well. Seeing the donkey suffer, the farmer felt terrible for it and intended to bury the well with his donkey to stop its agony, but as the ground nearly filled the hole, he was surprised to see his donkey spring out. It came out that the donkey had stepped on the ground that had been installed to reach the summit. Sergio then stated that he wants the pupils in his class to be like donkeys in life, using challenges and hurdles as stepping stones to reach their goals. Sergio indicated that he wouldn't pick what he wanted to teach and would teach what the pupils wanted to learn, but because no one said what they wanted to study, Sergio sat reading the newspaper until finally a student raised his hand and asked if he was still interested in how the ship could float. Sergio then asked why the balloons floated in the water while the bowling balls of the same size sank. After asking this question, he excused himself for a moment and told the students to find the answers themselves. When he returned, Sergio asked what answers they had received. One of the students answered that the size of the object is important. Another said weight matters. Sergio was glad to hear that because they were both right. Weight and size were concepts of density. Then he began to explain it on the board. Then they tested the theory outside. The principal saw them and came to complain, but Sergio immediately taught the children how to measure the density of abstract objects such as people, comparing their bodies to the principal's. Soon after that, the class ended. After everyone left, Paloma asked if Sergio thought he could become an astronaut one day. After hearing his student's dream, Sergio encouraged her and was sure that if she worked hard, Paloma would be able to fulfill her dream. Paloma was upbeat to listen that. Someplace else, Nico met his brother who fair returned domestic. His brother was befuddled to see him settling a harm dispatch. Nico said that he had learned apart approximately ships at school, so he needed to see his harmed transport able to drift within the sea like some time recently. He too said that on the off chance that it was conceivable, he needed to center on school and didn't need to bargain with his more seasoned brother's pack. When he listened his more youthful brother's words, his brother fair remained quiet. At the office, one of the instructors came to meet the foremost and said that he didn't like Sergio's bizarre way of instructing and told the Vital to upbraid him, so after work, the Vital went to Sergio's house. Sergio clarified that his learning strategy was interesting since he needed the children to be excited around considering. At his past school, the number of understudies got to be littler and littler each year until at long last, final year, there was not a single child who went to school, so when he moved to this modern school, he didn't need to lose his understudies any longer. The Vital was moved to listen that. He at that point permitted Sergio to instruct his way since. After getting consent, he inquired the Vital to assist him educate the understudies. Months passed. One morning, Sergio fair entered lesson when he saw Nico sitting there alone. When he was inquired why he came so early within the morning, Nico modestly inquired how to urge a young lady to like him. Calmly, Sergio told him to form the young lady feel extraordinary. He at that point appeared him a school grant brochure majoring in cosmology and told him to allow the brochure to Paloma since Paloma adored space science. Nico was confounded there as to why Sergio knew who the young lady he enjoyed was, but when Sergio needed to put the brochure in Nico's pack, Nico instantly took his pack and embraced it firmly as in the event that he didn't need Sergio to see what was interior. That was when Sergio realized that there must be something illicit in his pack, but he didn't need to drive him to appear it to him. He accepted his understudies were shrewd sufficient to decide what was great and terrible. After school, Sergio went to the principal's office and detailed almost one of the understudies who brought something unlawful to school, but when inquired what the student's title was, Sergio didn't need to tell. He fair needed to trust in him and accepted that his understudies would be able to unravel their claim issues, but he moreover felt too bad since his understudies were fair kids. Hearing Sergio's story, the foremost said that on the off chance that he didn't need to report, why did he come within the to begin with put? On the other hand, when Nico and Paloma strolled domestic, Nico appeared her the brochure from Sergio whereas empowering that Paloma would definitely be able to attain her dream. Hearing Nico, who cared so much approximately her, Paloma inquired him to halt by her house. She needed to appear something to him. When they arrived, Paloma took her telescope and after that took Nico to the beat of the Junk Mountain to see the rocket dispatch field not distant from there. Paloma told him around the world's greatest rocket that would before long be propelled there. He inquired Nico to guarantee to go with her to observe the rocket dispatch together. The following day, the foremost met Sergio and told him that there would be a designation from the government coming to the school to appear the understudies how to utilize a computer. Hearing the news, Sergio was upbeat that the school would at last have a computer, but when all the understudies accumulated to hold up for their unused computer, they found out that they didn't have an unused computer. The government assignment as it were clarified how computers work through a drawing board. Sergio cleared out the put in disillusionment. After school, Paloma's father was seen holding up for Sergio before the school. He was irate with Sergio for giving a grant brochure to his girl. He said that destitute families like them ought to be more persevering in gaining cash rather than being active sitting around idly at school. Indeed, in spite of the fact that Sergio had tried to persuade him that Paloma was a savvy understudy, the man disregarded it and didn't need his girl to anticipate as well tall. He was stressed that his girl would be baffled when she confronted the reality. Hearing that, Sergio was fair quiet. The another day, the Vital met with Sergio who was strolling domestic. The Vital advertised him a ride and inquired where his car was. Sergio told him that he had sold his car to purchase a tablet so the understudies in his course seem learn on the web. The Central was shocked that he was willing to do all that for his understudies. Sergio replied casually that it wasn't an enormous issue. The huge issue was that his spouse was frantic at him and he had to rest someplace else that night. Within the evening at school, an appointment from the instruction division came for an assessment. When he entered Sergio's lesson, he was confounded when he saw all the understudies pondering. Sergio clarified that the children were learning to calm themselves and control their feelings. The appointment from the instruction department scolded them for sitting around idly examining something that was not important rather than considering almost lessons that were included within the exam. He then asked Nico essential 6th grade questions, but since Nico couldn't reply, he called Nico a doltish kid before the other understudies. Nico was annoyed and cleared out. The appointment at that point told Sergio to meet him after lesson. At the principal's office, since his way of educating was considered degenerate and not taking after methods, Sergio was rebuffed with a 2-week suspension. Sergio was stunned since he as it were needed to arouse the students intrigued in learning by making the lesson more fun, but all the instructors as it were considered exams and disregarded the students' mental well-being. In the event that he was suspended, the understudies would be instructed by another educator. The lesson would return to being tense and boring lesson. He was perplexed that the student's injury with learning that was beginning to recuperate would return, but anything Sergio's clarification, the choice had been made and he was suspended for 2 weeks. After school, Paloma looked for Nico, who ran absent. When she found him, she attempted to cheer him up. She told him to disregard what the delegation had told to him since, for her, he was not a trick. She regularly paid consideration to him in course, and he regularly replied questions accurately, which implied that he was savvy. To cheer him more, Paloma kissed Nico's cheek. Fair when Nico begun to feel superior, his brother and his pack appeared up. The pack pioneer forced Nico to halt getting to school and fair work with him since he required a kid to gotten to be a drug courier. The pack pioneer saw Paloma, who happened to be there, and thought of kidnapping and assaulting her. Seeing Paloma in threat, indeed in spite of the fact that he was frightened, Nico was decided to require the group leader's weapon and shoot him. At the same time, when Sergio was approximately to take off school, he listened discharges and Paloma shouted, so he hurried to check, as it were to discover bodies lying there. He at that point attempted to calm Paloma, who was frightened, but when he checked the bodies one by one, he saw Nico was one of them. Weeks had passed since the occurrence, and indeed in spite of the fact that the suspension was over, Sergio still hadn't come to school and there was no news around him. Out of stress, the Vital chosen to visit Sergio's house. Sergio didn't need to come out and locked himself in his room. The Vital, who didn't need to provide up, said that he would proceed to hold up until Sergio needed to conversation to him. When he heard that, Sergio at long last came out. Whereas crying, Sergio said that he had fizzled as instructor. In the event that he helped Nico rather than letting such a little child fathom his issue alone, he would still be lively. Seeing Sergio proceed to fault himself, the principal told him that since he came to his school, he was cheerful to see the children in class become more dynamic and considering. In fact, understudies from other classes were desirous of Sergio's lesson. Indeed, in spite of the fact that they misplaced Nico, the other understudies still required him, particularly Paloma, who had been missing for days. Sergio may well be the as it were one that might bring Paloma back to school. Hearing the news fair presently, Sergio surged to Paloma's house. When they arrived at Paloma's house, Sergio attempted to influence her to go back to school, but Paloma couldn't do it. Her father didn't allow her. She said thanks to him for supporting her and believing that she may accomplish her dream, but it turned out that fair accepting was not enough. For a destitute child, she had to be able to acknowledge the biting reality. Sergio didn't need to force her and chosen to take off from there. When Sergio was almost to take off, Paloma's father gave him the telescope his daughter had borrowed from school. Looking at the telescope, Sergio told him that Paloma had never borrowed anything. The telescope was made by Paloma herself. He told Paloma's father that he ought to be thankful to have a lovely and smart daughter. In case she was bolstered, her future can be exceptionally shining. After Sergio cleared out from there, since he still couldn't accept it, Paloma's father looked his daughter's room and found a heap of books that Paloma had covered up. Seeing all that, his father felt exceptionally too bad. He fair realized that all this time, he had prevented his claimed daughter's dreams. Sometime recently going domestic, Sergio and the Vital halted by Nico's house. After Nico and his brother passed on, the house was purged. Within the patio, Sergio looked at the watercraft that Nico had fair wrapped up repairing, and with a grin on his confront, Sergio pushed the watercraft into the ocean. Days passed and the day of the ultimate exam at last arrived. That morning, Sergio was sitting alone in his course, holding up for his understudies to reach, whereas reminiscing the last year's minutes with his understudies. Not long after that, one by one the understudies arrived. Sergio told them to induce prepared, but when the exam was about to begin, Paloma still hadn't come yet. Sergio kept gazing at the entryway, anticipating her to reach. Luckily, when the door was about to shut, at the exceptionally final moment, Paloma finally appeared. He was diminished to see her. Sometime recently the exam begun, Sergio inquired his understudies to assemble. Whereas holding back the tears, he expressed gratitude toward them and reminded them of the fun things they had been through together in course. He accepted that they would certainly be able to wrap up this exam well, and whatever the result, he would still be proud of them. After hearing the inspiration, each of the understudies certainly begun the ultimate exam. A year sometime recently Sergio started instructing. There were as it were 55% of understudies passed the math exam and 69% passed the Spanish test. None of them got a tall score. In 2012, a year after Sergio taught, 93% passed the math exam and 63% of them got a tall score. 97.5% of the understudies too passed the Spanish exam and 72% of them got a tall score. 10 of his understudies reached the national best 0.1% in math. Paloma accomplished the highest score. Her story got to be a national sensation, and she got a full-fledged scholarship and afterward moved to a unused house. Sergio still taught the 6th review in Jose Urbina Lopez School. To this day, the school still hasn't had a computer room.